empowerment. So what we have is artisanal mining in the informal economy or criminal economy coexisting with the invasion of very large corporations. Women are forced by absence of social infrastructure to take their kids to work. There is very, very little of any quality of infrastructure for people who are evicted or even, quotes, resettled, which is hardly a resettlement. And people are living in a new servitude, which they didn't have before as artisanal miners. Women have a double burden, and you can see just what kind of a burden they have at work. So in their work, as they work, the common property rights that they used to have are being destroyed, rights to land are being destroyed, water bodies are being polluted, so that affects fish as well as water. The air is polluted, and a lot of local multipliers are being threatened by the invasion of very large corporations. And the writers who contributed to this conference talked about an uncertain legitimacy, or after Agamben, emergency as a norm, and imperfect citizenship rights. So going in the opposite direction to the direction that we've been talking about this weekend. This is almost my last slide. And what the idiom is not empowerment, it's not resilience. The idiom is resistance. What women are trying to do is to resist police harassment, criminal gangs, Maoist taxation, to resist the effects of pollution and toxicity of their environment, and to campaign for compensation and education, for which they need to know the art and the language of lobbying. That's something which is not familiar. Even these basic things, the acquisition of the language of officialdom, are things for which these women have to struggle. So they do work collectively, some to organise the kind of coal mining that you saw in the photos, and the transport of coal on their heads, small-scale mining on tailings and so on. And they do form associations and unions. They express their political aspirations and their resistance, not simply through the kind of politics we've talked about this weekend, but through art, through music, and also through witchcraft, through their own religion. And at worst, they express agency by leaving. They migrate out, they try to find their fortunes somewhere else. We have to consider whether that's empowerment, what that is. It's a huge act to leave your place of birth and move somewhere else as a working woman. Okay, so this is my last slide. Helena Kennedy yesterday talked about the power, and of course today as well, we've talked about the power of law, the necessity for law, the power of politics, but that they are necessary but not sufficient. And part of the bridging between necessity and sufficiency is social change and change in norms. Now, in the 4 cases I've just raced through, law and formal politics are of little relevance to the lives of these women. But what I hope to leave you with is this idea that they are capable of resilience, of empowerment through their daily struggles, of improvement in their work conditions, and of forms of resistance. So I've got a kind of 4-fold banner headline for you to take away. That these women who are basically at the bottom of society are themselves capable of agency which may or may not accord with your own definitions of empowerment. Okay.
Thank you. Great, thank you very much, Barbara. And it does speak to the notion of power, which is one of the things that we're going to have on the table. I wonder if Hamida, would you like to go next and share some thoughts and comments? Feel free.
Well, I wasn't expecting really to speak here. I came as Devaki's guest, but I'm very glad I did come, because for me it's been very educational, listening to the continuing inequalities in the post-industrial societies of Europe, and because I come from a very different culture, different society. And I thought actually, if you were looking at the position of women and the politics around gender, I would call it gender justice rather than inequality, because I think the women's struggles continues for struggle and for justice, rather than leaving it at male-female equality, I think. I was going to talk very briefly about women in two different situations. One is in the labor force and how they address the compulsions of their labor, the compulsions under which they work in the garment industry, which is, feeds into the global trade. And the second was to look at the constraints, the social constraints which keep, I would say, the social controls on women's lives. And I was going to talk about, particularly give you the example, more recent example. I think we all know conditions of work in garment industries and the export industry. We don't need to talk about that, long hours of work, low wages, inequality, and so on. But a more recent example which shows, which dramatically actually shows the compulsions under which women are made to work. Of course, they're earning for their families and probably coming out of the rural arena and coming into urban space and so on. But at the same time, it's a compulsion on the conditions under which they work. And this example also shows us what happens or how women and different groups strategize post the event. And the event I'm talking about is, which many of you might have read about, was the collapse of a building just outside Dhaka, about 1 hour away from the capital, where almost over 1,100 workers died, a large number of them being workers. There were about 5 garment industries in the building. The building was constructed without proper permissions and licenses, and obviously there's a lot of corruption, which enabled the owner to do that. And the compulsion was that the night before they had identified some cracks in the building, and the commercial offices which were there, like there was a BRAC Bank, they closed their office and they said they wouldn't come back. But because the garment industry had to move at a certain pace and there was an assembly line and so on, even though they all noticed the crack, the managers told the women to come back. And the women really had no option because they were told, well, if you don't come tomorrow, then you don't have a job yet. So they all came, and over 1,100 women died in the process. And this, of course, it was an eye-opener. Not that we haven't had accidents of this kind before or after, but not in such large number. So what I would actually, because your caption for this section was how do we move forward, what I wanted to talk about was what happened afterwards and how things were organized. And this was for the first time that I think trade union, women's groups, they all got together, not only within the country, but what was important was that we were able to, because I suppose because it made the international headlines all over the place, so we were able to get a lot of the European trade unions, some American groups together, and also women's groups in Europe. So there was the industrial group in Europe, which is a very powerful trade union, and there was the I forget the name, there's an organization in Amsterdam, Clean Clothes Campaign. And I think it's probably a rare occasion where trade unions agree to come together with, feminist groups and work together on this. And what happened as a result of this alliance, because there was constant communication because after the workers had died, or after the ones who were injured, they still needed hospital care, they needed false limbs, and so on and so forth. And where was the money coming from? Because our court system is so slow that they still haven't settled the amount of compensation that should be given. So, but all these trade unions across the globe got galvanized themselves and started putting pressure on the buyers, the brands in Europe, H&M and Walmart and Gap and so on. And I noticed that, students were holding rallies outside H&M saying, we will not buy from you because you're buying from Bangladesh and you haven't arranged for compensation. So what came out of this was that, with the pressure, that for the first time an initiative was set up where the brands then came together and agreed to set up a trust fund and contribute towards that trust fund. And through that process, they had a proper system of identifying the needs of each worker who was injured, or the worker's family which needed to be compensated. And through this process, there was involvement of the ILO as well in it. In fact, the ILO was coordinating the whole event. It took, I think, a year or two. They brought in, they set up, law students were invited to, or junior lawyers, and drew up the lists of whatever their needs were, how many years they'd worked, and so on. So very scientifically, they worked out the compensation that could be given to these people, and 3 or 4 hospitals agreed to do the needful for this. And so what is important about this, that it has set a standard, it has set a precedent, I would say. So the next time something like that happened, it was easier to move on and to make a similar kind of arrangement. And I think the point to be made from this is that although of course the trade unions were involved in all this, but this is a different kind of setting where everybody worked together. And in a way, the brands were held, the liability of the capital was also, I think, introduced for the first time, because previously it's been, whenever there's been an accident and the owner, the manufacturer would give a bit of money and forget about it, and workers didn't realize that under the law they are due for some compensation. We still haven't been able to change the law itself. The law comes to us inherited from the British 19th century, where the law says that compensation will be no more than 100,000 takas, which is, I don't know in pounds how much it works out to, maybe 1,000 pounds or something like that, which is highly inadequate. But this time round, they got about 20 times or 30 times that amount, depending on what the name